Hi, this is Tony Ward, and welcome back to part 4 of this sequence of short videos introducing cognitive psychodynamic therapy. And in this part 4 we're going to continue thinking about the application of cognitive psychodynamic therapy principles to the case of Monsieur K, which was the case that is described in our book. The book being Cognitive Psychodynamics as an Integrative Framework in Counselling Psychology and Psychotherapy, written by myself and my colleague Arnaud Plagnol, who is based at Paris 8 University in France. So at the end of part 3 we suggested pardon me, that you might like to think about how the framework for cognitive psychodynamic therapy can be applied to this case of Monsieur K. And here are some thoughts of our own. So in terms of the conscious cognitions that Monsieur K has, he seems to have negative and faulty thoughts, questioning whether he's good enough. There's also this issue about whether he's noticed, is he recognised, does he get credit. There's a very strong and powerful self-defining memory that he describes in therapy of his mother's choking experience. In terms of the inner world, there are some rich autobiographical memories around his siblings and his treatment by them, his difficult father. He seems to have schemas around pervasive lack of safety. And there are scripts, behavioural scripts, that drive some of his behaviour, which involve retreat and avoiding interaction. So in terms of his behaviour, there is a heightened sense of anxiety and threat, which results in patterns such as avoiding threats and avoiding social situations. As we described earlier, in terms of Grauver's theory about basic psychological needs, our behaviours are often driven through two main patterns, either approach or avoidance, and as often happens in anxiety and phobia, as we see here, this predominance of avoidance type behaviours in Monsieur K. So thinking about Monsieur K, there's clearly a conflict in the original home space, if you like. We use the metaphor of the home for the core, the foundation of the inner world. And you can see down here we use this damaged home space image here to represent Monsieur K's foundation of his core inner world and space. And we have an example of how this latches on to current events through the memory of his mother's near suffocation. And there's also stuff around a constant threat of a breakdown of the family unit, which comes about through tensions in the relationships of his parents. So these traumatic cognitions and thoughts, experiences, remain active and unaddressed in the core of Monsieur K's inner world. As we describe, what we can see with Monsieur K is attempts to strengthen that core space by building control space, trying to develop strengths around the core of the inner world to buffer it, if you like. So we can see this in terms of Monsieur K, in terms of his relationship with his brothers. He also talks about frequently going to his room as a sort of a refuge, place of safety, and his investment in activities such as combat sports. It's interesting, of course, that he chooses to direct his energy and interest into a combat sport, which you could see as perhaps being protective against something, maybe some lurking threat or dark space within that inner world. So these tensions in the core of the inner world are latent and lying there and can be reactivated later by new life circumstances. And we can see some evidence of this happening for Monsieur K, for example, during adolescence when he leaves the parental home. There's also some anxiety or change associated with his sister's marriage. His sister, somebody who would have been a source of stability in his life. There's issues around change at work, certain desires not being fulfilled. So, as described by Arno, this tension in the core of the inner world can be deflected, deviated towards new experiences, new potential phobic zones that in themselves are outside of the original foundation space, which Arno has called a deviation process, which is a bit similar to Freud's 1909 notion of displacement. Displacement being the substitution of a phobic situation for the phobic core. So within our inner world notion, these new situations may be symbolically associated with the symbolic core to create new deviations for that tension. So an example we've given here, which comes from the case of Monsieur K, is driving on motorways, on autoroutes, which starts to feel anxiety-provoking. So this gradual extension of an area of danger and anxiety leads to the inner world shrinking, maybe. Monsieur K may avoid certain types of driving situation as a result of this extension. And that in future may increase his avoidance behaviour. And this may further extend over time. So, for example, maybe work events or meetings at work start to become anxiety-provoking, again illustrating this gradual extension of dangerous areas and how the anxiety creeps out and begins to encompass more areas. So this inner tension can rise up as a crest within the inner world and link on to new situations, associate, to give it the cognitive jargon, become associated with new situations, which leads to interesting questions around why particular types of situations become that focus for attention. Why this particular type of situation? Why, for example, with Monsieur K, does passing lorries and trucks on the highway become difficult? Why does an element of agoraphobia creep in, a certain type of social phobia? So within our inner world perspective, we would suggest that the circumstance, the object in the outer world that is becoming associated may have dimensions that are metaphorically related to the original anxiety and fault within the core inner world. So take this example here with the lorry. What is it about lorries? Are they perhaps powerful, large, unpredictable, dangerous, etc.? And are those vulnerabilities part of the original fault within the core inner world of Monsieur K? So we've given some examples here of how those dimensions of vulnerability might be. These are dimensions that do occur in clients. So in terms of the structure of the inner world itself, that core foundation space, is it stable? Has it got solid foundations? Has it been breached? Has it become accessible to the outer world? Is it exposed? Is it actually a trap? Is it difficult to find a way out of? Does it have some kind of a dark side to it? So I'm alluding to that just now, talking about the fact that in terms of control space, Monsieur K puts quite a bit of effort into his hobby and interest in combat sports. Is that perhaps a counter to a dark side within that inner world and foundation space? We can think about the nature of the traumatic agent itself. We can, in terms of the lorry, for example, is there something about its power, something about speed, something about its vitality? something about its penetrative ability, and so on. Here are some examples about how we can develop these qualities in relation to specific phobias and circumstances. In terms of an aeroplane phobia, for example, is it seen as a trap? Is there something about speed, something about penetrating the inner world, instability of foundations, the dark side, etc.? And we can ask the same kind of things about social phobias and agoraphobias. In Table 1 of Chapter 8 of our book on cognitive psychodynamics, you will find further examples of different types of phobias and how metaphorically we could think about different dimensions of vulnerability which might relate to the inner world. So it might be interesting for you to perhaps try and apply this to yourself if it's relevant. Is there any area of your life that you sometimes find anxiety-provoking? Do you have any particular phobias? Do you think that these anxieties and phobias might have some kind of metaphorical value in thinking about your inner world? Do such metaphors correspond to your metacognition of the vulnerability of your inner world? How can such dimensions of vulnerability of your inner world also offer some resources, perhaps? In other words, how can you think about, in terms of those metaphors and vulnerabilities, ways of moving forward with them? So that's a little exercise that you might find interesting at some point. So again, thinking about Monsieur K, hopefully you've read the whole of the vignette now. There are 3 separate episodes described for Monsieur K, 3 different phases of therapy. So in terms of the 3rd episode, what dimensions of the home space, the original space vulnerability, is suggested by the scene of the mother's suffocation? What other dimensions of vulnerability could be in play? And are there elements in favour of this dark side dimension? So finally then, thinking back overall to the framework we presented through these sequences of presentations, what are the benefits of a cognitive psychodynamic approach in this area, in phobias and anxiety disorders? So we would suggest that the cognitive psychodynamic approach enables you to understand the pathological process better, understand the issues that are going on for clients. We can model them in flexible and dynamic ways, thinking about the inner world tensions and how those tensions might be activated by triggering circumstances. It can provide, we think, a unified framework to describe the rich variety of anxiety disorders, which we've already thought about in some detail. We think we can cautiously highlight how these client issues have their roots in the inner world of our clients, and enables us perhaps to search for the deeper meaning of the client's schemas. And it enables us to work with and understand the metaphorical value of the symptoms that our clients experience. Thinking about where interventions for anxiety and phobias can be difficult, the cognitive psychodynamic approach, we think, can help us to overcome blockages. So, for example, straightforward behavioural work with clients often will produce some progress, which can often be quite quick, but can quickly reach a plateau. So the client is left with the issue carrying on to some extent. It means that we can adjust the therapeutic objectives and methods to individuals. This relates to Carl Rogers' original notion that we need to really empathise with our clients by fully exploring and understanding their frame of reference. And this is something that the cognitive psychodynamic approach very much would buy into. Everybody is individual. Everybody has their own unique, complex inner world, which we need to understand and help them to work with. And in doing that, it provides powerful metaphors to address the vulnerabilities of the inner world, to help people to gradually overcome the dimensions of vulnerability, and hopefully to turn those dimensions into resources. So just to give an example of the metaphor, one type of metaphor which Arno has found very useful with some clients is the idea of an ocean. You think of an ocean. Our client is on the ocean. Perhaps they're in a small boat or a ship. It might be quite a frail ship on the surface of the ocean, which stands for their current conscious experience. And obviously down below that ocean, at submarine depths, there's all kinds of hidden stuff going on, past experiences and so on, zones of tension. And all those hidden depths will affect the surface of the ocean, affect what's happening at the surface. They may produce hidden currents and vortices, and this might then influence the situations that can trigger our anxiety. And of course we can think about the therapeutic space itself metaphorically, so that if the ocean works well as a metaphor, we can think about ourselves as on a voyage perhaps with our clients, trying to work out what it is that's submerged in the depths of the ocean, producing these currents and vortices which our clients are exposed to. So that's the end of the fourth part of this presentation. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you have come to see that the cognitive psychodynamic framework enables us to bring together cognitive and neuroscience theory along with psychodynamic principles around implicit memory, unconscious forces that our clients are grappling with. And if you want much more detail and depth on this, then please get hold of our book, Cognitive Psychodynamics as an Integrative Framework in Counseling, Psychology and Psychotherapy, which explains in more detail the various cognitive and psychodynamic and neuroscience theory, gives you the principles of cognitive psychodynamic therapy, shows how to apply this framework to core client issues, including depression, anxiety and trauma. And there's also several interesting chapters written by Arno about how we can extend this notion of the inner world and exploring our inner world into areas such as art and science and literature.